Okay, so in this lecture today, I'm going to be talking about international aid. I'm going to be doing two things. First of all, just defining what we mean exactly by international aid. Secondly, looking at how much do rich countries give and is it enough? And thirdly, looking at the arguments for and against international aid. So first of all, what do we mean exactly by international aid? Well, international aid we can define simply as the transfer of goods or services from one country to another as an attempt to benefit the recipient state. And it can either be bilateral, where the aid comes from one specific country, from the UK, such as the UK, or multilateral, meaning it comes from a group of countries such as the UN or the EU. There are two main types of aid. Firstly, there's what's called disaster relief or emergency humanitarian relief. This is the provision of immediate humanitarian assistance following a major disaster such as an earthquake or a hurricane or a war. And so this will typically take the form of things like medicine, food, healthcare facilities, even blankets and so on. Things to meet people's immediate needs if they've lost their homes or buildings have been destroyed and so on. So the point of this aid is very short term, providing for immediate welfare needs of citizens. The second main type of aid is development aid, which the point about development aid is investment in much longer term projects that are designed to set the recipient country's economy on a stable long-term footing. And aid given by the World Bank is an example of this second type of longer-term, what we call development aid. So you may be familiar with this phrase, give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. That would be like emergency humanitarian aid, giving someone a fish so they can eat. But teach a man how to fish and he'll eat forever. And this is more like long-term, the equivalent of the development aid, which will include, for example, things like investment in education and so on. So it's aid that's designed to put the country in a better position to better provide for its needs in the future. It's much more long-term. Okay, so having looked at those few definitions of aid and different types of aid, let's think about where we're at the moment in terms of the level of provision of aid. So first of all, do rich countries give enough aid? Well, since 1970, wealthy countries have committed themselves to a UN target of providing at least 0.7% of their total GDP as international aid. And yet here we are almost 4 decades after that target was set and wealthy countries subscribed to it, and actually only 6 countries in the world actually meet that at that target at the moment. That's the UK, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. So wealthy countries not doing very well there. This is a target they themselves set in 1970. They signed up to. The vast majority of the world's wealthy countries do not meet their own self-imposed target. In fact, most countries have reduced their aid budget since the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 and the resulting policies of austerity and public spending cuts and so on. We've already looked in previous lessons on neocolonialism at the remarkable statistic discovered by the NGO Global Financial Integrity that for every dollar sent from wealthy countries to poor countries, $24 of resources goes back in the other direction through whether it's debt repayments or what's called capital flight, money illegally leaving the country and being laundered in tax havens and so on, or through the wealth, the profit repatriation of TNCs, the profits made in the developing world by TNCs, the profits then being transferred back to their shareholders in the global north and so on. So there's actually general agreement now that the overall level of international aid is too low to achieve really significant development. And this puts the achievement of the UN's Millennium Goals, which is a series of very ambitious pledges to reduce worldwide poverty. It puts these goals at risk. Few specific examples: UN aid targets are which are aid appeals which are given by the UN in response to specific disasters are often not only unmet, but really the response is often quite pathetic. So for example, earlier this year, 2017, in February of this year, the UN warned that 4 countries in the world were actually at risk of famine. Somalia, Yemen, and Nigeria, and Sudan, South Sudan. And they said that they needed $4.4 billion of emergency aid just to ensure that these 20 million most vulnerable people across these 4 countries who they said were at risk of famine, they just needed $4.4 billion to ensure that they could prevent those 20 million people from starving to death. Here we are today, over 6 months later, and actually that target, they've only had 1/3 of that money has actually been pledged. And very often, even when pledges are made, the money is never actually delivered. And this is very common for these UN appeals for aid, is that they set amount of money that they need, and time and again, the wealthy countries fail to provide even that bare minimum that they've appealed for. Okay, so let's look at the arguments in favor of international aid, first of all. And the main argument is that aid is needed to really counter the structural inequalities in the global economy that we've looked at already. So the argument is that aid can actually help poor countries to overcome these structural disadvantages they face. Things like their dependence on the export of cheap raw materials to the global north, debt problems, and so on and so forth. And the argument goes that free markets alone are not enough to overcome these structural disadvantages, and especially in the light of centuries of colonial and neo-colonial exploitation. So aid, from this point of view, can be seen as a kind of foot up to help overcome some of the obstacles and structural disadvantages faced by poor countries and the countries of the global south. Another set of arguments for international aid basically argues that it's a moral obligation of wealthy countries to provide aid for poorer countries. And there's 3 aspects really to this argument. First of all, the first aspect is best summed up by what Peter Singer called the theory of general benevolence. Peter Singer is a moral philosopher, and he argued, quote, "If we can prevent something bad without sacrificing anything of comparable significance, then we should do it." And this is a basic moral principle. So applied to the sphere of international aid, this theory would suggest that given absolute poverty is clearly a bad thing, and wealthy countries are in a position to do something about it without suffering any comparable sacrifice of their own, then it's a moral duty for them to do this. The sacrifice they would have to make in foregoing some maybe of their luxuries and so on is not comparable to the suffering undergone by those in absolute poverty. So there's a moral duty. If you can help someone without making a comparable sacrifice yourself, and you're in a position to do that, you have a moral duty to do it. A second aspect to this moral obligation argument comes from the idea of human rights. Now, since 1986, the UN has accepted the idea of a right to development as a fundamental human right. And what this means is that it's the right of all human beings to share in the fruits of global development. So this in turn implies an obligation on all governments to uphold this right. And one way to do this is by the provision of international aid. So in other words, if countries have benefited from the fruits of development enough that they're in a position to be able to give aid, then again they have a duty to uphold the human rights of all citizens, of all the world's people, by sharing the fruits of that development with all humanity. And thirdly, a third aspect of the moral obligation case is the argument that the wealthy countries should pay aid to the poorer countries in recognition of the damage done to the global south by the global north, especially during the colonial period. So this point of view would see aid almost as a form of colonial reparations, damages paid in recognition of the damage done by colonialism. So those are 3 moral arguments in favour of aid. But there's also an argument that's often made that aid can actually be in the self-interest of the donors as well. And this is another argument for giving it. It's not only helping the poor at the expense of the rich, but it can actually help the wealthy countries themselves. And the basic argument here is that if poor countries are given enough aid to develop and become prosperous, then they can ultimately become trading partners in the future for the donor countries as well, and this will help the donor countries in the future. The best example of this, classic example of this, is what's called Marshall aid. after the end of World War II, Europe was completely devastated by the war, needed huge amounts of investment for restructuring, rebuilding, and so on. And the US actually provided $13 billion of aid to help rebuild Europe after the war. And this was actually considered in the US a very good investment, something that was in the self-interest of the US, because, well, for two reasons really. In the short term, a lot of that $13 billion was spent on goods and services from US business. So it was a huge injection of demand, if you like, that benefited US industry in the short term immediately following the war. But in the longer term, by rebuilding these European countries, the US was effectively rebuilding Europe as a trading partner that would actually go on to spend billions of dollars in the future on purchasing US goods and services, that it would not have been able to do so had the US not helped with its reconstruction after the war. Japan is also a good example of how the provision of aid can help create consumer markets for the donor countries, for US products. So again, after World War II, the US provided $400 million in food aid to Japan. But by 1975, Japan had spent over $20 billion on US food products. One US senator said, quote, "Japanese schoolchildren who learned to like American milk and bread in US-sponsored school lunch programs have since helped to make Japan our best dollar purchaser for farm products." So in other words, you give aid in the form of US goods and services, and then you cultivate a market in the future where people grow to like those goods and services that you initially provided free, and then they start paying for them, and you've created a market. Then further arguments in favour of international aid relate to the specifics of those two types of aid that we looked at. So if we think of the long-term development aid first, there's evidence that long-term development aid, when targeted carefully on capacity building for the future, really can help to improve a country's levels of development, GDP and so on. So Jeffrey Sachs, for example, who's a development theorist, argues that aid, so long as it's channeled in the direction of three specific areas, improvement of economic infrastructure, trying to boost food production, and the improvement of health